I'm Vanessa Feltz. The time 8:45 on Thursday, the 20th of August. I think it's fair to say traditionally August is a quiet month in London's property market. Why? Because people are away on holiday. They're not really thinking about moving house at this time of year. Unusually, though, the Times newspaper today features a large spread entitled The August Bounce Back, implying that the London property market is surprisingly buoyant at the moment. So let's talk about this. And we know we've already discussed on the programme today how important property prices are to Londoners' confidence, that feel-good factor that leads you to make, as they say, the big purchase. So to buy a car or to buy a mattress or to buy a sofa, to spend some serious money on something. It really helps if you think that your house is worth some money and that it's appreciating. Let's talk about all of this to Henry Pryor, the housing expert. Henry, pleasure talking to you. Good morning.
Lovely, Vanessa. Lovely to talk to you too. I hope you're well.
I'm all right, thank you, and I hope you are too. Tell me about what traditionally happens to the London property market in August, and then tell me about what's happening this August.
Typically, in August, Londoners flee, we go abroad, we go on holiday, we have the kids back from school, and the last thing that almost everybody is thinking about, unless they are an estate agent or a mortgage broker, is about selling their house. It's the gap between the traditionally strong selling season through from Easter to July and the start of the September selling season, which commences traditionally when the kids go back to school.
And now what's it like?
Well, now it's extraordinary. We've basically lost 1 quarter's worth of business. 30%, we think, of the deals, the business that would normally be done, the houses that would normally be bought and sold through a year, were lost as a result of the lockdown and the 2.5 months that we all spent getting to know our houses better. But what we found once the market in the capital reopened on the 13th of May is that, would you believe it, Londoners are really keen to look at where they're living, look at making some changes to where they're living, make it future-proof, and in some instances, it is fair to say, to look at perhaps getting out of the capital and eyeing up other parts of the country.
Now, obviously, that's not something we want to encourage on BBC Radio London. However, our job and mission is to reflect what's really going on out there. So is it fair to say that there are many people now who realise they will rarely be going into work in the centre of the capital, either the West End or the city, and are therefore reassessing, plus factoring in that desire that really was inbred and inculcated in all of us during lockdown, which is, I need some outside space. I don't even care how big it is. I just want somewhere where I can put a chair, sit in the sun, plant a tomato plant. That's what I want to do. I never realised I did, but now I do. So is this a mixture of those two things? I don't really need to go into work anymore. I want some outside space. Therefore, I'm moving either to a suburb or even further away from the centre of London. Is that what's going on?
Well, there's a bit of that, Vanessa. As you know, Phil and Kirsty like to remind us that it's all about location, location, location. And what the lockdown and the pandemic have helped Londoners to understand. And remember, not everybody has the luxury of being able to make these sort of decisions, but those that have been able to review their living arrangements have started to look and see that perhaps there are alternatives. They don't need to be perhaps in the centre of, in zone 1 for their work, as perhaps they have been for 30 or 40 years. But the good news is, for Radio London listeners, is that clearly there is still a huge demand for property in the capital, because the capital's estate agents have never been busier. They're selling stuff, and in some instances they're even selling it for March pre-lockdown prices. So the good news for Londoners is, if you want to buy and sell, you can. There are still an awful lot of people who want to be in the capital. We know, unfortunately, of the pressures on housing in the capital. So not surprisingly, there's a huge amount of slack that could take up any vacant properties that were to come up. But prices are holding up. You can buy, you can sell, you can rent and you can let. But what is going to happen in the future is what's keeping most of us in the industry awake at night. We're very concerned, Vanessa, about what might happen to prices going through until Christmas. Once we start to see the realities of the pandemic and the impact on people's finances, and what it does for their enthusiasm for property.
Well, of course, this was my next question. Obviously, for example, we take yesterday's figures, Marks and Spencer, letting 7,000 people go. So that's 7,000 people who will have no idea what their income's going to be, but who will fear that pretty soon their mortgage payments might be untenable, or they might not be able to make their rent payments, or whatever it is. And we've got that rolling out across the country in so many very different ways. And we know that the furlough scheme stops in October. So they're going to be many people, I would imagine, I mean, I hope it isn't so, obviously, but I'm thinking, and then we'll see whether you think this is right or not, that there are going to be people who are going to not want to sell their properties, but have to sell their properties. And that has a spiralling and net effect on the rest of the property market, doesn't it? Are you anticipating something like that?
I'm afraid I am. The housing market is driven. It's desperately unattractive to talk about it.
I know.
Particularly at this time in the morning.
I know. I'm
by
sorry.
the 3 Ds: death, debt, divorce. And I'm afraid all 3 of those are going to continue to generate and to create sales opportunities. And there will be, going forward, I'm afraid, millions of people unemployed. There will be millions of people who will be earning perhaps 80% of what they were earning just in January. But the reason that we're suspicious or perhaps even nervous about house prices is because it's all down to lending, and we're already seeing the banks and the building societies taking a much harder view, despite retaining the very, very low interest rates which they're continuing to offer people. That's down to the government and the Bank of England, but they're starting to reevaluate the terms on which they will lend people money. And if you can't take, or they won't take account of the contribution, for example, from good old Bank of Mum and Dad or Bank of Granny and Grandpa, if they're not going to take account of your bonus, and many people in the capital now remunerated to a great extent by their bonus now, these are going to restrict the amounts of money that people can borrow, and it is that that's going to drive prices or drag prices down, because they just simply won't be able to afford the prices that were being asked at the end of 2019. London property has not lost its lustre. It's still the centre of the world for many people. They still want to come here. They're still happy to buy here, and they're still confident, unbelievably, about buying here. But forget the talk of stamp duty changes. That's an irrelevance. It's a political gimmick. That will end at the end of March next year, a cliff edge. And we know that the housing market doesn't like changes on cliff edges or when it comes to taxation, for example. But the housing market remains in fine fettle. But the question mark is, we've lost some of that excess heat from the summer weather.
Yep.
Are we going to lose some of that from the housing market too?
Well, let me ask you then about the stamp duty holiday or rebate, or whatever it's called, moratorium. As you say, it's going to end in March. You said it's just a political gesture. It hasn't meant much. But I know people who, sat down and did the calculations on the back of an envelope and realised that this would be a jolly good time to move and to sell and to buy. And so it was making a significant personal difference to their decision to put their house on the market or to try and buy. So why do you say it's just a gesture?
Because Mr. Sunak has had a very good pandemic. He's one of the few politicians to have come out of this whole episode with his reputation enhanced rather than in tatters. But if we look at your friends, and indeed my friends, and more importantly perhaps even than that, my clients who are making these sort of decisions, we don't want people making a decision about their most expensive purchase based on the calculations they've run up on the back of an envelope. And when you look at what those numbers actually say, given that on the one hand, we've got an awful lot of people who are worried about house prices slipping perhaps 5 or 10% between now and Christmas, why would people rush to save, in inverted commas, £15,000, which is the maximum anyone would be saving, roughly 2% of the value of the average London home? Why would they be rushing to buy something if what they're buying is going to slip by possibly £50,000 to £100,000? That's the kind of confusion that we have in the market at the moment, because an awful lot of people seem to be, just like your friends and mine, quite happy to pile in and buy London property. And from estate agents, of course, long may that continue.
Yes, obviously it's very good news for estate agents and all those people who are successfully buying and selling. Could it be that there's a kind of, obviously the phrase, the phony war, that peculiar time before war actually broke out. Could it be that there's a kind of, in inverted commas, false heat, that it's been generated by all those months of lockdown? And you said it so beautifully, people learning to know and love their homes even more intimately than they did already. But actually, in reality, people getting thoroughly sick of their homes and realising all the deficiencies and what they want much more than what they've already got. And therefore, there's a heat in the market now that is a false flare, like a comet, and suddenly it's going to evaporate, and then there's going to be all this desperation as people clamour to sell properties and people realise that the bottom's falling out, the whole thing.
I think that there's no doubt that there is some serious concern about, once we start to see the true cost of what we've all been experiencing for the last 5 or 6 months, Once that starts to feed through to people's personal finances, you've talked about the kind of unemployment that we might unfortunately have to prepare for, and that a lot of people are already experiencing. Once we start to see how the nation is going to put its finances back together again, that's bound to include some additional taxation that will impact on an awful lot of Londoners. Those sort of headlines, once we start to see those day after day after day, are clearly going to impact on people's enthusiasm and their confidence. But, Vanessa, housing in the capital is something that touches us all, whether we are tenants or whether we own our homes. This is something that we're going to continue to talk about. We're going to continue to debate. The pressures on the authorities, the powers that be, and us as individuals to try and make the kind of housing that we think we want for ourselves and for our children is going to maintain these discussions. And I'm afraid, sadly for your listeners, will include further conversations between you and I talking about the health of the capital's housing market.
I'm sure it will. Now, usually we don't touch on commercial properties, you and I. We're normally discussing housing, and that's fine. In this instance, when you say there is a link, there is a web, everything's all mixed together, and even Londoners who aren't on the property ladder will be unwittingly affected by property prices, as we always are. Do we not have to factor in commercial property here and go to the basic equation of, many companies deciding that they don't want their staff to come in at all? Some of them are saying not ever. Some of them are saying not till next December. Some of them are saying all sorts of things. Obviously, they're then going to evaluate whether there's any benefit to them in having, premises in the city or in the West End of London. They may decide not to renew their contracts. Then you've got massive issues for commercial property landlords, and there's a massive trickle-on effect from that, isn't there? I know none of this is good, and I know you'd rather not discuss any of it, Henry. Forgive me, I can't help doing it, though.
No, I think you're absolutely right. There's no point in hiding away from the realities of what we are likely to face. There is massive debate about what the potential outcomes might be. I have a friend who has 3 office buildings in the city. He employs typically, or was employing at New Year, nearly 200 people. His monthly rent roll, Vanessa, is £1 million. He pays £1 million every month. He's getting no assistance or help or forbearance from either the government or from his landlord. And of course, he is looking at not getting all his staff back until at the earliest the new year.
Yeah.
So this is going to have a massive impact on commercial property landlords, on commercial property development, on the jobs that are based on that, on people's pensions. Many pensions hold significant amounts of commercial property, and therefore the exposure to the commercial property market will touch millions of us.
Yeah.
But it is important that we understand and that we remind ourselves that the capital's property market, both commercial and residential, has been historically incredibly robust. And whilst it will continue to ebb and flow, we are not yet ringing the bell for the death knell of the property market in the capital. It will continue. It will continue to provoke comment, discussion, and people will continue to make money. But they will also, I'm afraid, perhaps uniquely for the current generation, start to experience those who are going to lose money, and some people will lose big.
OK, you're dreading my saying this, but we all remember the last recession. We remember those people, and some of them were my actual generation, so I knew lots of them personally. We only clung on to our house by a thread at that point. We remember when the mortgages interest rate went up to, I think it was 13% or something utterly hideous and swinging like that, and many people were forced to hand back the keys, then live with negative equity. So they were still paying off for properties they couldn't afford to stay in, and that went on for years and years. Do you think there's a chance that we might, heaven forfend, be back in that situation?
No, I don't. And I'll tell you why I don't. We just had an update from the Office for National Statistics yesterday. Repossessions are in the hundreds, not in the thousands. There's absolutely there appears to be little likelihood of interest rates going to the sorts of levels that are going to put people under significant pressure. And the vast majority of people who, even if they were to experience negative equity, will have been stress tested by their lenders to ensure they can still continue to make the payments. Life will go on. People won't be that affected, but they will be changes to the way that we live and what we want from our commercial business premises and our homes as we go forward.
Thank you, Henry Pryor, very much, the property expert.